They say that everyone who is in prison says they're innocent, but sometimes they really are. I'm Adam Lloyd, and today I'm going to share with you an incredible case when this really was true. It began in December 2000 when 48-year-old Keith Hyatt had been out with friends in Tring, Hertfordshire, and was fast asleep when he was woken by a call from his friend Barry White, not that one, who was asking if he could pick him up from a nightclub. He explained how he'd been out with his girlfriend, 19-year-old Rachel Manning, to a 1970s themed fancy dress party in a bar above Milton Keynes bus station to celebrate Barry's mum's birthday. But the night hadn't gone to plan, and Barry got into a bit of a ruck with a couple of young men outside the venue. Rachel intervened to stop the altercation, and she and Barry had some words. Nothing unusual, you may think, after a few drinks for a young couple, but Barry had work in the morning, so he told Rachel he was going to head to Keith's, who would give him a lift home, and he told her to go back inside and get a taxi back. Keith headed over to the centre of Milton Keynes and picked up his pal Barry. Soon afterwards, at 2:43 a.m., Rachel called Barry from a phone box. She was lost. She needed to get home. They agreed to meet at a Blockbuster video store. Remember those? From where they could take her home. They got there at 3:13 a.m., but there was no sign of Rachel. The streets were now pretty empty at this time, but despite waiting for a bit and looking around, Rachel didn't appear. Increasingly concerned, Keith drove Barry around looking for her until after 5 a.m., when they finally decided to call it a night. Rachel had friends in the local area, so Barry assumed she must have gone back to stay with one of them. Barry kept trying her number the next day, but there was no reply. He then popped into the shop where she worked, and when he was told that she hadn't arrived for work that day, he called the police and reported his girlfriend as missing. Keith stayed in touch with Barry for the next few days, but worryingly, there was still no sign of Rachel and what had happened to her. Days later, on the 12th of December, Rachel's body was found near Woburn Golf Course. She'd been strangled, and her face was severely disfigured after being savagely attacked with a steering lock, which was found close to her body. Detectives found there had been a number of phone calls between the phone box and Keith's home, rather than just the one that Barry had told them when talking about the events of that night. This didn't ring true to them. Detectives believed that Rachel hadn't even made a call from the phone box, but Barry had been phoning Keith to tell him that he'd killed Rachel in an argument and to ask for his help in dumping the body and removing any evidence. CCTV footage had captured Barry and Keith driving around in the van in the early hours, presumably looking for somewhere to dispose of the body. Keith Hyatt was also arrested on suspicion of helping conceal a crime, and his van was seized. And when forensic experts examined the van, they found particles on the seat that matched those found on Rachel's skirt. This suggested strongly that she had sat in the passenger seat that evening. Barry was charged with murder, and Keith was charged too, as detectives believed that Rachel had been killed by the steering lock found in his van and had then been placed in the front seat where the forensic evidence came from before being dumped at the golf course. The murder trial took place in 2002. Emotions were running high as the jury heard how Barry and Rachel had been arguing all night, and this ended with Barry strangling his girlfriend. As we've heard, this was backed by forensic evidence. Barry and Keith strongly protested their innocence, and along with family, friends, and supporters, they expressed complete disbelief that the two could ever be guilty. But outside this group, public opinion was firmly that the two men were absolutely guilty, and they should go to prison for a long time, and frankly, the key should be thrown away. The jury came back with their verdict: guilty. They found Barry guilty of murder, and Keith guilty of the lesser charge of helping his pal cover up the murder. Both men continued to protest their innocence, and during his 2.5 years in prison, Keith wrote over 3,000 letters from his cell, and when he was released on parole, he wrote thousands more. One of those letters was to a British TV programme, Rough Justice. Remember that programme? Fantastic show. It uncovered so many miscarriages of justice with breathtaking research and outstanding journalism from their talented team. Let me quote you the reaction from the team at Rough Justice when they looked into the case. They said, If Barry and Keith had murdered Rachel and disposed of her body 8 miles away, they'd have carried the body over fences, up a muddy embankment, carried out an attack after death to disfigure her face, and got back into the van without taking any mud, blood, or debris from the scene with them, all within a window of 13 minutes. It appeared outlandish, and yet the jury had convicted, and pretty much everybody in Milton Keynes, apart from the two men's family and friends, thought they were guilty. That was our starting position at the BBC. It was now about getting the evidence to show that the men were not, in fact, guilty of the crime. The prosecution had used evidence from a highly respected expert, Professor Ken Pye. He might be familiar to you, he also worked on the Soham killings. One piece of evidence he found was that particles from the front seat of Keith's car matched particles found on Rachel's skirt, showing that she had been in the car that night. The rough justice expert showed the particles could have got on smoke of Rachel's clothes at any time in the 16 hours before her death. And moreover, this could have come from any disposable lighter, so it didn't back up the claim at all. This also assumed that if they had killed Rachel, she would have been put in the front seat of the car, it makes no sense, does it? As they would have put the body in the boot. As technological advances in DNA continued, the team were able to examine the DNA of a hair found on the steering lock, which had been used to kill Rachel, and they found this didn't belong to either Keith or Barry. Tracy from the team at Rough Justice said, if Rachel was already dead, they would have put her in the back of the van, not propped her up in the passenger seat. The lack of blood and mud, which would have covered a man who had bludgeoned a victim and then taken her to a muddy undergrowth, was also overlooked. It's fair to say that a good forensic scientist knows that the absence of evidence is evidence, but that message is not always adhered to, added Tracy. In 2007, 2.5 years after the Rough Justice programme on the case came to air, the Court of Appeal quashed both men's convictions. Barry faced a retrial a year later and was again cleared. Barry said afterwards he still thought of the life he could have led with Rachel, saying, I was going to ask her to marry me on Christmas Day. I'd bought the ring. You never know, if she'd been here today, we might still be married and have 2 lovely kids. It's just a question now. It was 2010 when father of 5 and waiter Shidul Ahmed was arrested. He had sexually assaulted a female student in Luton. The woman had thought he was a taxi driver, and it could have been a lot worse had a passerby not come to her rescue. A quick-thinking lorry driver noted his number plate, and so Shidul was traced and arrested. As is now standard, his DNA was taken, and 6 months later, this proved a match to the hair found on the wheel lock that was used to kill Rachel Manning and on her clothes. He was rearrested and interviewed by police in September and December 2011. He declined to answer questions, but when asked, he provided written statements which said that he could not explain the presence of his DNA on the steering lock. He told detectives he did not recognize the lock, but he regularly bought and sold cars at auctions, so he may have owned it in the past. And detectives found that Ahmed had in fact sold his car 8 days after Rachel was murdered, in the early hours of the 10th of December. Ahmed, who denied murder, first stood trial in January when a jury failed to return a verdict on the murder case. At the retrial at Luton Crown Court, the jury heard that his DNA was found on the steering lock and that it was totally improbable that a hair found on her clothing was not his. Ahmed, wearing a grey shirt and surrounded by 5 security guards, chose not to give evidence during the trial. His English wasn't great, so he sat with an interpreter in the dock. The court heard how Ahmed attacked Rachel after she rejected his sexual advances on her way home from that fancy dress party in December 2000. He then bludgeoned her face with a car steering lock in an attempt to make her unrecognisable before hiding her body in undergrowth on the golf course. There was a hush around the court when the jury returned from their deliberations, but this time, the jury of 7 men and 5 women returned a unanimous guilty verdict. Cheers rang out around the public gallery, and Ahmed bowed his head as he was sentenced to life in prison. Barry White had to suffer hearing the details of Rachel's death for a 4th trial, and later told how he was still made to feel guilty by the accusations made against him by the defense at Ahmed's trial. There were audible gasps from the public gallery as he was told at Ahmed's trial that Rachel might still be alive had he got into a taxi with her. How must he have felt? It must have been horrendous for him. An emotional Barry stormed out of the court after giving evidence, his eyes wet with tears. "I'm still fighting," he said. "I've had enough of fighting." Rachel's family also released a statement which showed that despite Ahmed being found guilty of Rachel's murder, they still felt that Barry White was at least in some way to blame. They said, "We believe Rachel would still be with us today if she had not been abandoned by her boyfriend the night she was attacked, killed, and brutally battered. We cannot forget that." Interviewed in 2022, Barry told how since he'd been released from prison, he'd not been able to work. He'd suffered from PTSD and other issues. Now in his 40s, this one night had also ruined his life. And he did nothing wrong. It has been suggested that sometimes a powerful detective goes for one person based on a hunch or circumstantial evidence. Sometimes I guess this can be a good thing. But combine this with a poor legal team for the defense, and this is where miscarriages of justice tend to happen. A prime example of this is Andrew Malkinson, who spent 17 years in prison for a crime that he didn't commit and ruined his life as well. As I said at the start, almost everyone in prison claims they are innocent, and sometimes they are right. Until next time, cheerio for now.